Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Ex Situ and our Q&A session with Dr. Dan Exton this morning. We're very excited to welcome Opwall's very own Dan Exton, the head of research at Opwall, to chat with us a little bit more about artisanal fish fences from his lecture, Hiding in Plain Sight. As a reminder, my name is Sophia Wood. I work at Operation Wallacea as well as Friends of Wallacea, Opwall's sister organization that helps our partners develop long-term tourism operations around the world to support conservation efforts. If you are tuning into our YouTube or Facebook Live today, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat on Facebook or YouTube, or you can email them to us at xsitu@opwall.com, even during the lecture or even during our chat. If you're watching this from the Opwall website, you will have to click the YouTube button to open the stream in a new tab, and that will give you access to the chat. And also, if you look at the top of the Ex Situ page today, on the Opwall website, you can sign up to receive the newsletter when we announce that we have new Ex Situ episodes out. So please sign up and enjoy our chat with Dan Exton. Nice to see you this morning. Well, morning for me, Dan. How are you?
You too, Sophia. Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Not too bad. Yeah, I'm back full time with Opwall tomorrow, so this is my final hurrah before it's back to the grind.
Excellent. Well, we're lucky to have someone who works internal at Opwall, because I think a lot of people end up with a lot of questions about how Opwall works internally as well. So I guess before I leap into some of your specific research, I'd love to hear kind of how you first got involved with Opwall.
I remember it was a long time ago. I think I've got a classic story from you as well. I think Sophia started off as a volunteer. So when I was at university as an undergraduate in the UK, one of our lecturers was linked with Opwall, was one of their academics. And so we went on a field trip to Hoga, our Indonesia site, in my second year undergrad, and just kind of fell in love with the whole thing. I had no plans to be a scientist. I just thought marine biology sounded cool at university. I wanted to, do what most young people do, get my degree, get out, earn as much money as possible. And I've kind of gone the complete opposite, earning as little money as possible. But yeah, that trip to Hoga is what I guess made me want to study coral reefs, made me fall in love with the whole idea of tropical marine biology. And so I went back that summer as a volunteer to do my dissertation, my thesis on Hoga again. And then I stayed involved. My master's, my PhD was linked out there as well. And then luckily, just as my PhD finished, they were looking for someone to come and run their marine science. So I took the job, moved up to Lincolnshire, which is kind of the Louisiana of the UK.
Right.
US people on here, yeah, kind of middle of nowhere, really rural. And I've been here ever since. That was 9 years ago. So yeah, that's me.
Okay, well, and now you run Opwall's site on Hoga today.
No, actually, you know what? I've not been to Hoga for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so when I moved to Opwall, at that time, Hoga was kind of our big site where all the marine research happened. Almost all of our papers came from there, and Opwall wanted to bring someone on board to replicate that, to build a new Hoga, basically, out in the Caribbean. So I've been running Honduras ever since, and slowly trying to catch up to Hoga.
Right. Yes. So you run the Honduras marine site, and people who come out to volunteer there will be lucky enough to meet you.
Lucky, yeah, whichever way.
So I guess it sounds like there's a common thread coming through, obviously, for a lot of people, of volunteering in the field before making their way into kind of the conservation world. So one of the questions we got as well was kind of what is the best way to start getting involved with conservation? So I guess, and also, do you need to have a PhD?
No, not at all. I mean, I think a PhD ties you more into the research side of things. I'll always be more of a researching conservationist if you have a PhD, rather than maybe a practitioner on the ground. There's no one size fits all approach, really. I've seen amazing conservationists who have not even been to university at all. I've seen a lot that have gone for practical experience and have just spent a long time working their way up through organisations. Obviously, a lot of people come through organisations like Opwall out into the field. I think it's an an important way of working out whether it's for you, the challenges involved in this kind of work, but also just proving that you're someone who can cope in those difficult environments. But then on the other side, I know plenty of great conservationists who have PhDs, who have gone down the academic route and are really making a difference through their research and through kind of, on the ground research leading to conservation. So there's very one size fits all. I love my PhD. I think a lot of people would absolutely hate doing a PhD. So I definitely don't think anyone should ever feel they have to be doing a PhD. There are so many different routes into it.
That's great advice. So I've asked that question to basically everyone who's come on so far, because I think it's a question that's very much in the mind of a lot of people who are thinking about going into this field and wondering what it takes. And obviously talking about both sides of it, the field research, Gabby last week had kind of similar thoughts as well about being able to understand or volunteer and understand what it really means to do field research, and not, that it's not necessarily sexy. It's actually generally unsexy. And even though it seems like it could be really exciting a lot of the time, there's a lot of parts of it that are, data entry and looking for insects in poop. And
that kind of mindset never changes as well, because even now, 15 years later doing this job, my mum still thinks I just sit on a beach drinking cocktails and swimming. Most of my friends think I don't really have a proper job, and that can be quite tough in its own way. Everyone wants to be taken seriously, and the moment you have a job that other people maybe can't relate to very well, then they just revert to type, and I'm just training killer whales really, as far as
that's interesting. Well, so I'd love to get into a little bit of specifically your research and obviously the topic of this lecture, which was, your research on fish fences. So you mentioned that you started working with fish fences during your master's. How did you kind of come across this topic, and what interested you about it to turn it into such a big project?
It's a really good question, actually. The weird thing with fish fences is, they're huge, they're everywhere, and so many people see them all the time, and no one pays them any attention. I think because they seem so passive, if you saw people working on them, if you saw people building them, you might kind of spot them a little bit quicker.
Sure.
And when I started my master's was very much in terms of human governance. So I moved away from ecology and I was looking more at kind of bigger picture stuff. So my dissertation had to include aspects of law, social sciences, kind of economics, as well as natural resource usage, ecology, biology, all those kind of things. So fisheries was an obvious fit because I wanted to stick with coral reefs. I wanted to stick in Indonesia, and fisheries were, such an important thing out there. So I kind of focused in on fisheries and just was chatting to a few people that worked out there already, and we were talking about the different aspects of the fishery and what I could do. And we actually came across this little data set that had been collected a few years earlier, that they looked at all the different gear types around the island that we work on, around Caladupa. And fish fences just jumped out at us as something that seemed quite interesting. We started delving into them, couldn't find any information on them really. No one was studying them. So we thought, well, it's the perfect opportunity to see if there's something interesting going on.
Definitely. Well, it's such I said something I'd never heard of before myself. And I think one of the things that was particularly interesting about your talk was the social aspect of it. So obviously it kind of is the intersection of maybe what I was talking about with Friends of Wallasey a few weeks ago, and what a bunch of our other, biologists and ecologists lecturers have talked about, which is, conservation is something that involves people, and especially local people, and these, local systems of finding food are, making one of the biggest impacts on the industry, even if it doesn't seem, or on the ecosystem, even though it doesn't seem like as big as, these massive fishing boats, for example. So you found obviously a lot of research about, these fish fences and how they're affecting the fish communities. So if the local economies are entirely reliant on these fish fences, what income alternatives do the communities have? so that we could start to move away from these really damaging fences?
Yeah, that's the challenge, really. I think we talk about fisheries a lot, and people focus on the fish, and you think the fish are the most important aspect of this whole story, but it's people. It always is the people. The people are the ones controlling how this is happening and the way they're fishing, and they're the ones that are relying on it. So the challenge really is to change the behaviours of the people rather than just studying the fish themselves. So the economy out there isn't entirely reliant on fish fences. Fish fences are one of 50 plus different types of fishing that happens out there. They just seem to be one of the most damaging. And I think the biggest challenge with fish fences is the motivations behind using them. They are, I guess, for want of a better phrase, a lazy man's fishing technique. You'll see some fishermen out there that are working all day, every day, really hard graft, going out there, catching fish with spear guns and nets and things like that. But then you've got fish fence owners who don't have to put much effort in. Once it's built, it's done. They can just pay some money to have this nice, efficient way of fishing. So the real challenge is how you replace that kind of opportunity for someone, because people's motivation for using them is a little bit different than for other types of fishing. So whereby you might be able to move people to other types of fishing if they're willing to put the effort in. These people are much less likely to do that. So it's a good question. I think the only way really is probably to ban them, or to limit their use, to force people away. I don't think it's something that you can incentivize someone not to use, because how do you incentivize someone to do something that's a lot harder than the way they're already doing it? So I think it is one of those few examples where the stick beats the carrot.
Do you think there's possibility for that kind of legislation in Indonesia, in such a challenging place to govern?
Possibly. And it all comes down to designation. So if you're a fisherman in Indonesia, if you're using what they call a traditional type of fishing, then that is automatically permissible. So there's no law covering traditional fishing. And that's a way of protecting these hundreds of millions of people that have to fish to feed their families. If you're an industrial fisherman using big trawlers and boats, then there are more controls and it's easier to put laws in place to restrict them. So the argument would be that fish fences are considered traditional because they're built out of simple materials and they've been used for a long time. But in terms of their impact and the number of fish they're catching, I'd argue that they're industrial. So I guess that the easy route would be to convince the government that these aren't traditional fishing gears. They're harming the rest of the community. They're harming the environment. Maybe they could be redefined in the same way that blast fishing was. Dynamite fishing was a huge problem, and it's still a huge problem in a lot of places. But it's also been fairly successfully managed in other places, because it was quite clear, look, these people are blowing up the reef. That's obviously a bad thing to do. So, okay, the government comes in and they're happier to put rules in place to stop it happening. So if we can make the same argument with fish fences, then perhaps. And we've got a lot of interest from WWF and from the Indonesian Ministry of Fisheries we've been talking to, and in other countries as well. In Tanzania, for example, they're already banned on the island of Zanzibar. So it hasn't been done in other places. Yeah. And it's just, replicating that on a larger scale.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, there's a couple of questions that come out of that, but the first one that kind of came up is, obviously, again, we've talked a little bit about what it looks like to go or conservation on the ecology side, being in the field, all the way to conservation kind of on the policy side. So what does it look like to translate your research on these fish fences into now kind of this project that I'm assuming sounds like you're heading towards pushing for a policy decision in Indonesia?
We are, but I think the policy would only provide the framework to make a change. For those people listening who haven't been to Indonesia, 17,500 islands, huge reliance on fisheries. So the government can put in new laws all they like. The majority of those islands will probably never even hear about the law, let alone do anything about it. So, the biggest change will come when you persuade communities that fish fences are bad. That's the real challenge, because generally the wealthiest people are the ones that can afford to build a fish fence. So they're also the ones with the most power and influence in the communities. So the other challenge is, how do you persuade communities that the guys that they're probably a little bit scared of, or that have power over them in the community, are doing things they shouldn't be doing? So I think it has to come from two directions. You have to have policy to support what's being done, but then you have to get local buy-in from communities. And that's where organizations like, we can do it on a very small scale in that, one part of that tiny part of Indonesia, but you'd need Indonesian government, you'd need NGOs, you'd need WWF and TNC and people like that to work with the communities that they work with. I think that's the harder part of the puzzle.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. And that kind of got into my question about, obviously, the governability of Indonesia and the ability to, legislate and enforce laws in an island that's 3,000 miles away from the capital. So the other thing that came up in just what you were chatting about is fish fences are found worldwide. They're not just in Indonesia, obviously. So do you know anything about kind of how they developed independently in all those areas, or culturally, if there's connections between designs or uses of fish fences between these areas, or even, for example?
So if you read some of the old kind of classic textbooks about fisheries, where they've got really dodgy sketches of things, they think that structures like these are pretty much the oldest type of fishing, even back up in the Arctic and in places like Canada. Where you've got ancient people 5,000-10,000 years ago, one of the easiest ways for them to fish was to build fences in rivers, so that the fish would be sucked into the net, as with the current of the river, or in estuaries and things like that. So we believe it's a natural progression of that type of fishing. But how it kind of springs up in its different types and different designs around the world, who knows? But I guess it's just for a fishing community, probably quite an obvious strategy, that if you've got the tide coming in and out every day, well, if we build a massive fence, then everything that's trying to move with the tide is going to be trapped. And it kind of goes from there.
That makes a lot of sense. I remember hearing about similar things with the salmon in the Pacific Northwest, where I am now. So obviously, I just think it's particularly interesting to see such a similar strategy across, the entire globe. I think you're right. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense if you're watching the tide or watching the way the salmon move, that you can very easily kind of take advantage of the water flows.
When we're talking about fishing, you almost have to think about types of fishing as living things. They evolve in the same way that an animal evolves. They prey on certain species. They target certain ecosystems. They live in certain habitats. And over thousands of years, fishermen have evolved the perfect way to fish. And fish fences seem like a pretty good way of fishing, if that's what you're about.
Yeah, that makes sense. So have there been any efforts to get people to reduce the mesh size, if they're not willing to totally remove the fish fences, so that they can allow the juveniles to survive and obviously help support the reef a bit more?
There has been. We did some work on that in Indonesia, where we looked at kind of trialing larger mesh sizes in some fish fences, and we also looked at different mesh designs. So we looked at slats rather than holes in the net. And the moment you do that, you have to look at the motivation for why the mesh got smaller over time, which is because they're catching fewer and fewer fish.
Of course.
It's quite an important concept to get, is that these fishermen aren't catching juveniles because they want to. They would rather catch up to eat juvenile fish, too many bones, not much meat on them. But it's a desperation thing, and as there are fewer and fewer fish to catch, they have to resort to more destructive ways of catching those fish, which means juveniles. So the moment you increase the mesh size or change the design, they're catching so many fewer fish that the whole thing becomes pointless. So they will just revert back to the small mesh size again. So, one option could be to enforce a law where mesh size has to be a certain size, and that means fish fence owners just won't bother anymore. I think in reality, it will just mean fish fence owners use a smaller mesh size than they're allowed to use, and no one will know about it. So, I think it probably wouldn't work as well as it might.
Right. And obviously, a lot of your research was about the damage to reefs, and obviously the reef ecosystems based on these fences. So if you remove a fence, How long does it take for that reef to kind of repair and rebalance itself, or does it ever?
It's a good question, and we don't know, to be honest. Because we're the only people, as far as we know, that are researching this. There's still a lot of things to answer. We can look at other types of impact events. If your reef is impacted by blast fishing, where the reef's destroyed, we know that can take decades to recover. And if we look at bigger impacts like coral bleaching, some reefs will never recover. So it will probably depend on what's happening on the reef in general. Reefs are deteriorating, and that's probably one of the biggest messages to come out of the paper, that stopping using fish fences is not going to save a coral reef in the long run, but it will improve their resilience. It will make them better at fighting climate change for a while at least, and buy them a bit of extra time. But as climate change goes on, and as all these other stresses go on, if you remove a fish fence, the chance of that reef recovering goes down and down and down. So there will be some recovery, but it wouldn't be full.
Right, that makes sense. So we got a question in recently about whether there are any environmental education programs in the area using this kind of fishing gear to raise communities' awareness about the damage of using it. I assume Opwall is doing some, but I don't know if there's any wider efforts.
So in the area we work, we've done a lot of work with that in the past. We had a big UK government grant way back to run these kind of programs. So putting together focus groups, bringing fishermen together with other members of the community, trying to better understand who are the main players in the communities. It's always quite interesting that you assume the fishermen themselves are going to be the big decision makers, but it's actually mostly their wives and the women in the community that are quite happy to stay in the background and make sure the big decisions are made with how money's spent and that kind of thing within the household. So we've done a lot of work with different members of the community, trying to educate them on the impacts of overfishing.
Right.
And those issues come back again to the types of people who are using these types of gears. So, we actually got the communities to agree to the idea of reducing fish fence use and limiting the number of fences that can be built. But then those decisions get moved up the chain to the senior people in the village, who are generally the fish fence owners, and then it gets kind of stamped out by them. So it's tricky. There are also a lot of kind of cultural beliefs in Indonesia amongst certain fishermen about why fish numbers are decreasing.
Okay.
We talk to a lot of fish fence owners and say to them, are you catching fewer fish now than you were 10 years ago? Yep. They will say, absolutely, we're catching way fewer fish. And you say, great, okay, that's great, that's good. Why do you think that might be? They say, because the gods are cursing us, there's some reason. Don't worry, they'll be back. If we just carry on fishing, eventually the fish will come back. So there's a big kind of gap there in the knowledge of the impacts of fishing on the fish themselves. So there are a lot of challenges with that that are hard to break, but we'll keep working on it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the cultural change is kind of the hardest part of all of this work. So obviously, I imagine there's a long way to go, even just where Opwall is working, let alone across the entirety of Indonesia where you've seen these fences. So we're just about 5 minutes to go. So if anyone has any questions about fish fences, marine biology in general, or even for Dan and his role as Opwall's head of research, please feel free to send those through to ex-situ@opwall.com, or just chat us on Facebook or YouTube live chat. And I'll be sure to ask Dan your question before we finish up here. So until we receive any more questions, we've got a few more about kind of the specifics of the fish species kind of crossing over these fences. Obviously, you talked a lot about the fish species that you found in the fences versus on one side or the other. Wondering why there are so many species you found in the fish fences and then nowhere else on the reef.
So they're definitely there on the reef. I think it all comes down to a matter of effort. So, I've helped out one of my co-authors, Rich Unsworth, before, where he studies fish that live in seagrass beds. And the best way to do that is to wade out there at different times of day with a big net and just see what fish you catch. And you list the species that you've caught, and that those species live in a seagrass bed. But even the most intensive bit of research, really, you're only going to get a little snapshot of the fish that you happen to catch in those fences, in those nets at that time of day, in that particular location. Whereas if you've got 150 fish fences around an island that are there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, there are going to be all these species that use seagrass beds that you're never going to catch unless you're researching 24/7. So it's just a case of effort, I would assume. So yeah, it's interesting though, very eye-opening.
Yeah, definitely. Why do some fish species migrate back and forth between these kind of shallower and deeper environments while others don't? Obviously, I'm sure size has something to do with it, but
size and trophic position's quite big as well. It depends on their life strategy, really. Some will move for food because they feed on different kind of items and different habitats. Some will move for protection. So smaller fish will often move into the shallows at night, for example, so that big predators on the reef won't get them. Others will have their juveniles live in seagrass beds and shallow habitats for protection. And others will migrate for spawning. They'll spawn in the mangroves or on the seagrass beds. So they'll move from the reef at certain times of the month or certain times of year. So it can be lots of reasons. You know, you've got the most biodiverse community anywhere in the oceans living around coral reefs and seagrass beds, where you have all these species, you have evolution of a multitude of different strategies. So yeah, it varies from species to species, but lots of different reasons.
So it's almost like a rainforest that you have such different, niches.
Absolutely.
In the whole area. It's very cool.
Absolutely.
I'd love to go diving there. It sounds really beautiful. So as we're wrapping up, I kind of wanted to move back into a little bit questions about conservation, how to work in conservation, because I think a lot of people would like to work in similar positions to you, where you're spending part of the year doing field research, being in the field, and a big part of the year as well organizing and helping do conservation policy and larger research projects, obviously through OPWL. So what would be your advice to an early career conservationist or someone who thinks that they want to go into conservation about how to explore this field and find a job that suits them?
I mean, I think the first thing is you've got to know it's for you, and not only the nice stuff. You've got to enjoy both sides of it. Like you say, I'm lucky enough to spend a couple of months a year in the field, but the other 10 months, there's a fly buzzing around me. The other 10 months of the year, I'm sat in an office in front of a laptop, playing around with data and writing things. So if you don't enjoy that part of it, you're not going to enjoy this career, because that's still the majority of it. I'm lucky that I love that side of it as well. But again, like I said at the start, there are so many ways into it, but I think experience is so key, and you can't overestimate the importance of experience. And that's really the challenging part, because so many people are in different, personal situations where they may not have the time, the energy, the money, the opportunity to go and get experience. But I think, I get asked that question a lot, and my advice is always experience can take a lot of different forms. Experience can be, helping out on a weekend in your local wildlife reserve in the UK. It doesn't have to be traveling to the other side of the planet. You can stay at university and do more studies there. You can do so many different things to get experience, but above all, you've got to make yourself known and make yourself heard. Go to conferences, chat to people online, get yourself on social media and talk to scientists. I get messaged by people now and again who just want to have a chat and ask for advice and see if there's any work that I've got going on that they could help out with. And most of the time I don't, because we've got loads of people helping out, but they've made that connection, and then I know them and they know these people. And when you're looking to hire people down the line, those names jump out at you.
Absolutely.
That's not an easy skill. It can be quite daunting to approach people who you see as, being a bit further down their career. But in my experience, most people in this kind of field, at least the good ones, are approachable. They remember what it's like to be at that stage 10 years ago. They enjoy talking to people who are just starting out, and they're always happy to have a chat on the phone, over email, give advice and help with that kind of thing. So I think it's just putting yourself out there. Join Twitter, follow scientists, follow conservationists, see what they're doing, engage with people that way, and it will evolve from that, really. But you can't force it. It's one of those things that you just got to keep plugging away at it, and if it will happen, it will happen.
Well, I think that's That's great advice. And especially now, because all of these scientists who want to be in the field, this is everyone's field season, are trapped in their homes and probably would be more than willing actually right now to have a chat with uh, a young conservationist who's thinking of entering the field, who would want to ask questions about their research and what could be done. So if you are listening, I think it's a great time to start networking. And actually, I think you're the first person who's talked so much about networking um, in this field. So that's really helpful advice. I think you hear about it a lot in field, business and in other fields, but networking in obviously the conservation field isn't something that people talk about a lot. And actually, we got a question through about it, about what would you suggest are the best platforms to find and communicate with scientists? Is it Twitter, LinkedIn?
It's Twitter these days, definitely. I think that's the go-to place for scientists and for conservationists in terms of talking to each other, putting out opportunities, collaborations, that kind of thing. But I would probably say networking is now the number one skill for a scientist to have and a conservationist to have. 20 years ago, science was done by 2 or 3 people locked away in a lab or an office, not talking to anyone else, do their work, publish it, move on, job done. Yep. Now, you look at papers that are published, they've got 20 authors on, 30 authors from all around the world, collaboration. And I think collaboration is amazing. And I'm so glad it's gone this way, people working together. And so networking is essential really now. And it opens doors and it makes opportunities. But I would say Twitter is the one to go to. Okay. Follow people that are working in the field that you enjoy, follow people you've heard of, and just grow it from there.
Well, that's great advice. I think obviously, just even watching these lectures, getting an idea of all the different potential niches that you could go into are a good way to start thinking about where conservation could lead. I think that's one of the other challenges, obviously, as well, because there are so many different niches that you can go down between, on the scale between going into the policy side, going into the field research side, going into the desk research side. Obviously, you're kind of blending those things, but you find a lot of people who've chosen one of those specific niches. So for anyone who's been watching our lecture series, I think you probably have an example of at least one of every category on there that you could reach out to and chat with. So I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for your time, Dan. It was great to chat with you.
Yeah, you too.
And obviously, thank you everybody for tuning into this Q&A with Dan Exton. If you have any further questions for us at Opwall or for Dan, please feel free to send them through to exsitu@opwall.com, and we will see you again next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, guys.